Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Stanley Blair, Ph.D., Associate Professor of English at Monmouth University. Stanley earned his doctorate at Duke University. He served as Dean of Monmouth's Honors School and currently teaches American literature there. I understand some of his students are here to hear him. You can grade him this time. Over his career, he's garnered an impressive array of awards, not only from Monmouth University, but from the New Jersey College English Association. But what brings him here tonight is his fascinating passion for the literature of Monmouth County. Yes, you heard right. The literature of Monmouth County. He has made a study of and is on an ongoing search for literary works that are connected to New Jersey, specifically to Monmouth County. He specializes in books about, authors from, and references to our state and region. He's always on the alert for local stories and brings local references to the light to his students and encourages them to not only study the work of literature, but to leave the classroom and explore the region to see the local connection. He can't lose with this audience. His fascinating focus combines two of our favorite things, stories and local history. Stanley has presented his research at academic conferences at the state and regional levels, as well as closer to home at the Monmouth County Historical Association, the Historical Societies of Asbury and Middletown, and at the Long Branch and Ocean Libraries. Tonight's presentation is a revision and expansion of his 1923 talk for the Monmouth County, his 2023 talk for the Monmouth County Historical Association with the intriguing title, The Infamous Long Branch Murder of 1860 Solved. Enough said. Welcome, Stanley. We can't wait to find out who done it.
Thank you, Peggy. Just to clarify, I'm interested in history. I'm not from 1923, which would make me historical. All right. Can you all hear me okay? Yes. All right, good. So, let's get started. I begin by thanking the Township of Ocean Historical Museum for inviting me to speak this evening. Of its board members, I'm specifically grateful to Lois Kiley, who heard an earlier version of this talk and suggested an encore, to Peggy and Ted Dellinger, who have facilitated this event and my being here in several ways. Thank you. Also to Paul Edelson and Gary Edelson, and as friendly and as kind as they are knowledgeable about local history, all four have been immensely encouraging to me. Let me also acknowledge the presence of several of my students and advisees from Monmouth University. If you're from Monmouth, please say hello. 1, 2, 3. Hello. All right, good. I like to bring communities together. I am grateful to them that they're taking their learning beyond the classroom and into the community. And I hope they may see modeled in this audience what lifelong learning looks like. Okay. Memories of the infamous Long Branch murder of 1860 have long since faded away. Its only remaining memorial are some digitized files and one dusty old book. Yet you can still remember what happened. In the city of Long Branch, New Jersey, east of where Broadway ends at Ocean Boulevard, on the boardwalk with the Ocean Place Hotel to your back, look east. If you can see, in both space and time, you can gaze upon the spot where, in August 1860, hundreds of people gathered for a couple of days on the beach to gawk at the gory evidence of a murder and watch for the victim's corpse to float ashore. The staffs of Long Branch hotels and boarding houses were checking to see if anyone was missing, while those elsewhere who had family or friends in Long Branch tried to verify their loved ones were still alive. For days, even weeks, in New York City and across the eastern two-thirds of the United States, newspapers circulated theories about the possible victim, perpetrator, and motive. But the victim was never identified. In addition, within a day or two of the murder, credible reports of a second crime related to the murder evoked public outcry for justice. Multiple crimes with multiple victims and multiple perpetrators at large, perhaps, until tonight. To summarize the events of August 1860 centered on Long Branch, three overlapping patterns of events occurred. First, the murder. Beginning on August 7th and running through at least the 19th, dozens of newspapers east of the Rockies printed accounts of a murder that had been committed behind the beachfront Monmouth House Hotel. Evidence included, on the beach, indications of a struggle, a pool of blood, and next to it, a wooden club with blood, hair, and brains. Ooh. Sorry about that. I'm not showing them to you. Drag marks and a blood trail. A fishing boat moved about 50 feet from where it had been parked the day before. In, on, and near the boat and its sail were blood, drag marks, and a blood trail. A missing anchor and rope and 3 pennies. 2 witnesses had heard a gunshot and screaming around midnight. In the absence of a body, hotels and boarding houses were checked to make sure no one was missing. The most common scenario was that the victim had been struck with the club, dragged to and loaded in the book, and sunk at sea using the anchor and the rope. The newspapers advanced various theories as to motive, victim, and perpetrator. The first proposed motive was robbery, with the proposed victims being either a woman or a black waiter or a Newark tourist. The second proposed motive was revenge against a southern planter, with the perpetrator being a disgruntled black waiter or the planter's enslaved servant. Each of these theories was rapidly debunked. The local coroner convened a jury that found, despite the evidence and testimony, the jury found that no murder had been committed. Second, and this gives you an idea behind me of the nationwide scope of the press coverage. Second, the hoax. Starting on August 9th and continuing at least until the 22nd, the same newspapers that reported the murder then began publishing updates, noting that in fact not a murder had occurred, but instead a hoax. The identity of the hoax or hoaxers was unknown. Third, the response to the hoax. Running from August 9th to at least the 25th, responses to the hoax included making fun of what had occurred and calling for the hoaxers to be brought to justice. Look at how many newspapers. I like this one. This Jersey hoax has traveled all over the country, and for every mile it travels, about 2 yards of nonsense is added to it. New York Herald. Vanity Fair. A few newspapers attributed the hoax to a group of Long Branch waiters and barbers, but this seems unlikely, for they might have been fired on the spot or worse. As August passed into September and the summer of 1860 drew to a close, no one confessed. Within weeks, Lincoln was elected president, and weeks after that, Southern states began to secede. The infamous Long Branch murder and hoax were soon forgotten. I've just summarized the first half of my research on the Long Branch murder hoax. You can find an earlier but more detailed account of these events online on YouTube, shameless plug, in a talk given to the Monmouth County Historical Association back in August entitled The Infamous Long Branch Murder of 1860. Tonight's talk revises and builds on that earlier one and includes some new discoveries as we go on the trail of the hoax's perpetrators. August 10th and 11th, 1860, I know nothing. I know students there have been waiting patiently for me to say the words, I know nothing. During the murder investigation and hoax discovery, an anonymous correspondent for the New York Leader, using the pseudonym C, filed a report from Long Branch on August 10th that the Leader published the next day. C filed the report from Blossom Lodge, Mansion House, Long Branch, New Jersey. The Mansion House was a block south and across Beach Drive from the Monmouth House, behind which the murder occurred. The correspondence report indicates that during the past week, arrivals at the branch, that is Long Branch, have been legion. Given that the report is dated August 10th, this past week indicates that C was at the Mansion House starting around August 3rd. 10th, a week earlier, the 3rd. Therefore, during the murder-induced public panic on the 7th and 8th, C would have noticed his hotel staff checking to make sure no one was missing, as well as the hundreds of people at the crime scene just across the street, within a direct line of sight from the front of the Mansion House. However, unlike other newspaper reports, C's report avoids the murder and the hoax. Instead, C reports about the many people who are coming to Long Branch and the benefits they experience, as if the murder and hoax had not decreased, but had increased local tourism. Not until the last paragraph does C mention the murder, and only the murder and not the hoax. And even then, let me go back a slide here. We have had a sensation in the way of a murder, which I learned from the city papers has recently taken place here. I know nothing of the circumstances and doubt if any clue will be found to the culprits or their victim. As for the murder, C filed his report from literally across the street from a murder scene attracting hundreds of people, but professes to have no knowledge of the murder except what was published in the city newspapers. Yet he states confidently that there is more than one murderer and that neither murderers nor the victim will be identified. Also, C says that his source is city newspapers. But some of these papers, the New York Times and the New York Herald, had already reported the hoax on the 9th and 10th. Yet C does not even mention the hoax either. By addressing the murder only in passing, and by overlooking the hoax completely, C creates an impression that either he is totally clueless about events across the street, or he knows details that he is not reporting. If C's report sheds little light on Long Branch, it does reveal some details about C himself. First, C seems associated with the New York Leader because the report was sent to and published there. Also, when younger, C was familiar with the area around Long Branch by having walked through it. Quote, long years ago, the topography of this country was rendered familiar to me through expeditions on foot after the manner of a German student, and many diversified incidents attended my pedestrian efforts. Elsewhere in the report, C seems to confirm this. Quote, the ocean has many sources of attraction to me, and I never weary of my olden fondness for the great waters. So C was once familiar with Monmouth County in the area near Long Branch and knew the area by foot. Finally, C's report suggests his approximate age. What the phrase long years ago means is inexact, but that length of time is quote unquote olden. The comparison to a German student suggests that long years ago, C was also a student, which would make him not young in 1860. Sure enough, the report's next sentence discloses that C is now a little too old to go on expeditions by foot. He prefers, quote, exercise in the way of an armchair or the soft cushion of a carriage as more congenial to our repose of mind than long tramps afoot in search of adventure. He used to be familiar with the area by foot, but now no longer takes long walks. My research is ongoing as to the identity of the leader's correspondent C, but C may have been one of two editors of the New York Leader. First, C may have been John Clancy. Remember the name, you'll see it again. Then, Clancy was not only an editor of the Leader, but a frequent summer visitor to the Blossom Lodge at the Mansion House in Long Branch. Certainly, the initial C matches the name Clancy and its second syllable. However, there are a few issues with this explanation. Clancy was born and raised in New York City, so in his student days, he was not likely to have rambled on foot through the Monmouth County countryside. Moreover, in August 1860, Clancy was barely 30, perhaps no longer a young man, but certainly not yet middle-aged. He was only 34 when he died 4 years later in 1864. So, while Clancy, like C, is associated with the Leader, seemingly unlike Clancy, C has past familiarity with Monmouth County and claims not to be young. A second candidate for the identity of C is Henry Morford, who had joined the Leader as associate editor in 1857 and soon rose to editor until he resigned shortly after the hoax to take up a position at the Sunday Atlas, starting as early as August 19, 1860, as the hoax was still drawing to a close. Born in 1823, in 1860, Morford was 37, a few years older than Clancy, and just past the biblically allotted midpoint of 70 years, perhaps too old relative to life expectancy to prefer long walks through the countryside. Also, Morford was born and raised in Chanceville, now New Monmouth, Middletown Township, which means he had knowledge of Monmouth County geography. To sum up then, relative to other city papers then reporting the details of either the murder or the hoax, C did neither. Now, C may have been either Clancy or Morford, or a collaboration of Clancy and Morford, or even someone other than the two of them. Other evidence is needed. A droll recollection, January 1863. So my English major students out there, this is where the literary connection comes in. About 2.5 years after C reported for the Leader, in January 1863, the New York publishing firm of George W. Carleton published a book of sketches entitled Sprees and Splashes, or Droll Recollections of Town and Country. Its author, Henry Morford, was at that time mainly known as a journalist and a poet, although he was also writing dramas. He had owned his own newspaper, the New Jersey Standard, in Keyport, near where he was raised in Middletown, from 1852 to 1856. He then moved to New York City and began working for a series of newspapers there, starting in the Standard in 1855 and continuing in other newspapers up until at least 1862. He had written a series of humorous sketches about people and events he, or those close to him, had observed. At first, he titled his series Recollections of a Country Shopkeeper, his profession at his father's and uncle's general store. After his move to New York City, his sketches began to include people and events in the city, and so he retitled the series to Droll Recollections of Town and Country. By late 1862, he had accumulated enough of the sketches, published and unpublished, to select the best and publish them in book form. The series title in the newspapers became the book's subtitle. In Morford's book, the 11th sketch is entitled The Long Branch Murder, the same topic mentioned by C near the end of his 1860 article in the Leader. Morford's sketch opens in Blossom Lodge Mansion House, Long Branch, that charming little clubhouse in the rear of Sammy Laird's mansion house in Long Branch. This is the same location from which C filed his report. Finally, Morford's narrator says that the events happened a couple of summers ago. For a book published in January 1863, the sketch was written no later than 1862. Thus, a couple of summers ago refers to the summer of 1860. So quite apart from the possible similarities between Morford and C as people, they also both wrote about the Long Branch murder. This raises the more general question of how factual or how fictional Morford's sketch about the hoax is. Readers of Morford's sketch might easily miss or gloss over the book's preface, which provides the answer. There he states that he has first or second-hand knowledge of the hoax. In this collection of sketches, all the incidents related are personal to the author or within his knowledge to intimate acquaintances. This means that Morford either knew of the hoax directly or knew somebody who had direct knowledge of the hoax. Evidence in this sketch suggests he may have been present during the events in Long Branch. In the sketch, Morford is somewhat evasive about the first character to speak. No matter what was the real name of the speaker, Morford writes, I shall call him for the occasion Smith. In English-speaking countries, among the most common of surnames. However, the sketch provides an important clue to this Smith's identity. When in the city, he could be heard of not 1,000 miles from the city hall. So that's the clue. In addition to Morford being an author and an editor of the New York Leader, he was appointed as the reader for the Board of Aldermen, one of the legislative bodies in the New York City government. He had served in the position since 1857 and was serving in it at the time of the murder and hoax, having been reappointed for another year in early January 1860. His job was to read documents aloud to the aldermen, who met in City Hall. He was a reading clerk. Thus, the clue about Smith, that he could be heard of not 1,000 miles from City Hall, is understatement, but technically accurate and truthful about Henry Morford. When inside City Hall, and especially in the chamber where the Board of Aldermen convened, one could hear Morford doing his job as reader. So one possibility is that Morford depicted himself in the sketch as Smith, and therefore might have been in Long Branch during the murder and hoax, and so to Morford's actual sketch. On its first page, Smith addresses another visitor to Blossom Lodge, somebody named Captain Joe Darling of the 106th Ward Police. As everyone knows Captain Joe, the narrator continues, I have not the least occasion for describing him or giving his leading characteristics. The one physical characteristic the narrator gives is that Darling is bald. Now, anyone who goes to research Captain Joe Darling or where New York City's 106th Ward is doomed to fail. For no such person or place ever existed. I know, I tried. This is because Morford changed the name and location. Here again, reading Morford's book's preface is helpful. The preface says that where well-known persons have been introduced, a thin veil has been drawn over their personality by slight changes of name, while the sound is generally near enough to enable friends to trace out the reality. In the sketch, the narrator says, everyone knows Captain Joe. In the preface, Morford says that in the sketches, well-known persons are presented with slight changes of name, the change being to the sound of the name, which is near enough to the actual name. Now, we do not have to be a friend to Captain Joe Darling to trace out the reality, because his real name was actually mentioned in press coverage of the murder. The sketch's Captain Joe Darling of the 106th Ward Police sounds very much like the police officer named on the front page of the New York Times on August 8th, 1860. Captain Joseph Dowling of the 6th Precinct Police. Aha. Morford represents Dowling as Darling with the same rank, the same first name, gives him a similar sounding last name as the preface says, and exaggerates which ward by adding to it 100. The real 6th precinct to the fictional 106th ward is round number hyperbole, consistent with the not 1,000 miles in the description of Smith. I have in my notes here, if you're going to tell a whopper, add zeros. In Morford's sketch, the narrator describes Dowling as bald. Depictions of Dowling in the New York Public Library show him as bald. In addition, the New York Times front page story of August 8, 1860, Dowling is said to be at Long Branch, and he will doubtless prove a valuable auxiliary to the authorities of that place in searching for the murderer. In Morford's 1863 sketch, let me see, I might have that here. Yeah. In Morford's 1863 sketch, Captain Joe Darling, an old expert in the detection of crime, was called upon to examine the boat, the club, the blood, and the hair, and gave it as his opinion that a fouler crime had never been committed. So, several similarities exist between Dowling and Darling, including that they were both at the crime scene. In real life of 1860, Joseph Dowling was, in fact, a very good detective. In one news story from March that year, a suspected diamond thief and accused jewelry thief turned himself into Dowling. In early May, Dowling tracked an escaped murderer to a brush-making shop. He questioned 25 workmen, determined that all of them were lying, searched the premises, found the fugitive hiding in a sealed barrel, and apprehended him. Later in May, he was offered a promotion to inspector of the lower end of Manhattan and adjoining areas of Brooklyn, but he refused it because he wanted to keep working in the 6th Ward. In June, after he showed probable cause and obtained a warrant to search the residence of a suspected watch burglar, police found not the watches, but instead quantities of allegedly stolen expensive clothing. Now, because in real life, Captain Joe Dowling's exploits were often reported in the New York newspapers, one may determine with some certainty what he was doing just before being reported at the crime scene in Long Branch by the Times on August 8th. The answer is that in the last week of July 1860, he had just solved a year-old cold murder case. Here's what happened. A year earlier, on July 30th, 1859, as reported in the New York Daily Herald and New York Times, police found a Spaniard named Juan Gustarino dead in an alley off of Baxter Street, apparently due to intoxication. At that time, the coroner determined that the cause of death was a ruptured blood vessel. A year later, on Saturday, July 29th, 1860, so we're talking 8 days before the murder, the coroner determined that Captain Dowling took a statement from a Mary O'Brien, who claimed that Gustarino did not die from intoxication, but rather was murdered by her former landlord, Richard Bavindan, with whom she had recently had a dispute. O'Brien told Dowling that Gustarino, the victim, exhibited a large sum of money to her. O'Brien spoke of the money to Bavindan, who, quote, immediately proceeded to her room and, striking Gustarino with a heavy club, killed him instantly. Sound familiar? According to O'Brien, Bavindan then called another woman named Margaret Welsh and with her assistance removed the body to the alleyway. In effect, Mary O'Brien made up a story to get back at Bavindan, who had committed the murder. The Daily Herald continues, the coroner and his deputy are confident that Mary's story is a sheer fabrication. They say death could not have been produced by a blow with a club without leaving some external trace of violence, and they assert there was no evidence that any weapon had been used. So, days before the Long Branch murder, in real life, Captain Joseph Dowling was told by Mary O'Brien that Gustarino had displayed money and that to get it, Richard Bavindan had struck him with a heavy club, had killed him instantly, and had removed the body from the crime scene. There was neither some external trace of violence nor evidence that any weapon had been used, leading the coroner to conclude that O'Brien's story was a sheer fabrication. Not a hoax, mind you, a lie. A week later, on the beach at Long Branch, an apparent robbery victim was struck on the head with a club and killed, and the body dragged to a boat. The parallels between O'Brien's Baxter Street fabrication and the Long Branch hoax are striking, especially when one considers again that Dowling was in both places at both times. In Morford's sketch, what was the motive for the hoax? Smith complains to Captain Joe he's bored. Captain Joe replies to Smith, stay where you are for 24 hours. Meanwhile, I'll bet you 1 even 50 that there's excitement enough in Long Branch within that time to satisfy even you. Hold your tongue, whatever you may see or hear. That is part of the bet. That is, the motive for the Long Branch murder was for a police officer to win a $50 bet. As for how the hoax was accomplished, in Morford's sketch, Captain Joe then consults with 2 accomplices, Lance and the Colonel, fellow New York City employees. Morford writes, what occurred among the 3 can only be fancied, but that mischief was in the wind was most certain. Like a good general, Captain Joe was issuing orders for some great roguery that was to follow. Now, one may speculate as to the real-life identities of Lance and the Colonel. The name Lance is actually relatively easy to figure out. In a way, his real name has already been mentioned a few times tonight. Like the alteration from real-life Dowling to fictional Darling, the name Lance follows Morford's preface's principle of slightly changing the sounds of names to protect identities. One cannot say the name of John Clancy without saying the syllable Lance. Dowling and Clancy had known each other for years. They were from the same neighborhood, Manhattan's 6th Ward, and both were involved with its politics, as well as the city political movement called Tammany Hall. Hall, for which Long Branch's Blossom Lodge served as a summer retreat. The New York Dispatch of July 30th, 1871, looking back 15 years earlier, noted Clancy's family influence in the 6th Ward, so this is 1856, and says, it was this fashion of pulling together that gave the 6th Ward crowd, as they were termed, such an influence in Tammany Hall as to secure a very large proportion of the best offices in the city. John Clancy, Matthew T. Brennan, and Joseph Dowling were a strong combination. The article goes on to explain that they were strong because they took care of their friends. In Morford's sketch, the plan for the hoax is then revealed. The colonel strolls down to the beach and speaks to a local fisherman named Sim Casey and offers him $10 to leave Long Branch overnight. He's the missing person. Meanwhile, Lance drives Captain Joe to Long Branch Village. There, Captain Joe visits the butcher and gets a shave at the barber. The narrator hints what else he did at either of the places is among the mysteries to be revealed. If he, Captain Joe, brought anything away from either, he carried it in his pockets. The narrator later reveals those mysteries. Perhaps there are people who believe that the hair came from the barbers at Long Branch Village, the blood came from the butchers, and the club from a neighboring woodpile. In Morford's 1863 sketch, fictional Captain Joe's hoax methods thus parallel real-life Mary O'Brien's July 1860 fabrication that she had told Dowling a week before. In real life on the Long Branch beach, Dowling appears to have simulated O'Brien's fabricated crime, but more realistically, as only a detective of Dowling's caliber might have known how. As for the opportunity for the hoax, that opportunity presented itself late that evening, as the sketch said. The night was a moonlit one, and Captain Joe may have strolled on the beach to enjoy it. But if he did, nobody noticed him. Public events in Morford's sketch. Public events in Morford's sketch then proceed much as the newspapers reported them in 1860, but in greater detail. This includes the spectacle of Captain Joe going to the beach in the morning and pretending to inspect the crime scene to gaslight everyone that his mischievous trick was really the evidence of a murder. Morford's sketch even includes comments on the city press coverage. Quote, the good people of this city were indebted for the paragraphs with startling headings, which appeared in all the newspapers the same evening and the next morning. Atrocious murder at Long Branch, great excitement at the boarding houses, arrest of the supposed perpetrator. All the papers, we note, except the New York Leader, for which Clancy and Morford were then working. The sketch ends with an ambiguous confession. Perhaps there are people who believe that Captain Joe, Lance, and the Colonel perpetrated that murder and have not yet been punished. Who knows? This question dodges the issue, which was not a murder at all, but a real-life hoax. Why did Morford change Dowling's name to Darling and Clancy's name to Lance? One reason is that Morford's publisher, Carleton, would not have wanted to assume the potential legal liability of publishing real names and having real people claim defamation. This is why even today many creative works, such as books and films, must include a disclaimer that the work is fiction. A second reason for the name changes was that the hoax ended in August 1860 with newspaper editors calling for the hoax's perpetrators to be identified and prosecuted, if not criminally, then civilly. The hoax had caused near panic in Long Branch and public concern across the country. So, in Morford's 1863 sketch, covering up the hoaxers' identities might have been legally necessary for Morford and Carleton and was legally beneficial to Clancy and Dowling. I'm sorry, there's a typo here. This should say March 1863. Improvising characters. A few weeks after the publication of Sprees and Splashes in January 1863, Morford's account of the Long Branch murder hoax was reprinted by the local newspaper he had once owned, but sold back in 1856. The New Jersey Standard ran Morford's sketch on its front page on February 20th, 1863. That newspaper was distributed in Monmouth County, and at least one local resident mailed a copy to a family member in the Union Army during the war. A few weeks later, the Standard received some war news from a soldier in the 11th Regiment of the New Jersey Volunteers, stationed at that time in Virginia, who had read Morford's account in the newspaper and wrote to comment on it. According to the National Park Service, the 11th Regiment had fought in the Battle of Fredericksburg on December 12th through 15th, 1862, a horrific loss for the Union side. On January 20th to 24th, the regiment marched to Falmouth, Virginia, where it recovered until April. While resting at Falmouth in early March 1863, the letter writer, one John H. Smith of Company I, wrote the following to the Standard. Newspapers have again made their appearance in camp, as for some time their sale was prohibited. Your correspondent also recently had a glance at the well-remembered figurehead of the Standard, and therein read the said-to-be denouement of the celebrated Long Branch murder, which created so great an excitement about 3 years ago. The old adage that murder will out is again verified, but this time in a rather doubtful manner, as there be those living who do know of the way in which that hoax was perpetrated, and can, if necessary, reveal every particular connected therewith, with the names of the parties engaged. Nevertheless, it serves to form a chapter in Mr. Morford's Sprees and Splashes, and authors, we suppose, must be allowed the privilege of locating incidents and improvising characters. John H. Smith objects that Morford did not provide the names of the parties engaged. However, while Smith ran the New Jersey Standard's reprint of Morford's sketch, that reprint omitted crucial context, the book's preface, which provides the clues by which the sketch's apparently fictional characters might be understood as real people whose names were altered. Without the guidance of the preface, Smith believed that Morford fabricated the setting and characters. April 1877, a sensation for discussion. After Smith's letter, in the following year, 1864, John Clancy passed away. However, both Henry Morford and Joseph Dowling advanced in their careers during the 1860s and 1870s. Only months after Sprees and Splashes, Henry Morford went on to publish 3 then popular novels about the Civil War, Shoulder Straps, The Days of Shoddy, and The Coward, in which he criticized the Union home front on such topics as stolen valor and war profiteering. After the war, Morford increasingly turned to authoring a series of travel guides for New York City, Paris, Europe, Canada, California, and the West. As for Joseph Dowling, he was elevated to the position of city judge. He heard cases and sent convicted criminals to Manhattan's infamous halls of justice, better known as the Tombs, one of New York City's legendary prisons. Then, after weeks of illness, Judge Dowling died on May 13th, 1876. Less than a year later, on August 9th, 1877, Long Branch was preparing for the upcoming summer season, as reported by the New York Daily Tribune. While the Tribune did discuss what it called improvements since the last season at Long Branch and additional attractions and conveniences. It also waxed nostalgic about what the branch was and is. With both Clancy and Dowling deceased, the article recalls them wistfully. The end of the second paragraph notes that, quote, 10 or 12 years ago, John Clancy and the Shining Lights of the Blossom Club were present every summer season. What follows in the third paragraph appears to confirm that Morford's sketch is apparent fiction that sheds light on history. For the Tribune's reporter discloses the parties involved in the Long Branch murder hoax of nearly 17 years earlier. Totally improbable that I found it. It's a needle in the haystack. Political caucuses, I quote the article, were held at the Mansion House, and practical jokes were well planned and executed, as when Judge Joseph Dowling got up the sensation of the Long Branch murder and duly telegraphed particulars of the affair to Mr. Matsell at police headquarters in New York, and when journalists were temporarily provided with a sensation for discussion in the sanctum, that is the Blossom Lodge, at Dowling and Clancy's instance. They mean insistence. The Tribune's 1877 article is so far the only confirmation of what Morford's 1863 sketch says and hints at. The article and sketch both say the hoax was planned at Long Branch's Mansion House, and more specifically in the Blossom Lodge. The article says directly, and the sketch indirectly, that Joseph Dowling was the primary perpetrator. The article mentions a detail the sketch does not, which is that Dowling himself telegraphed news of the alleged murder to the New York City Police Department, whence it was picked up by the city newspapers and spread across the country. Finally, the Tribune article also says that Dowling and Clancy insisted on perpetuating the murder hoax to reporters at the Mansion House, consistent with Morford's sketch detail that Dowling collaborated with Lance and interacted with reporters. Two sources, then, the Tribune and Morford, identified Dowling and Clancy as the main conspirators behind the hoax. There are other parts of the story that I have not presented here tonight or have not yet researched. Confirming C's identity will require more research in the New York Leader archives, and determining whether Morford published his sketch separately in the New York Sunday Atlas between 1860 and 1862 also requires more research. As for the Colonel, I have not yet identified him. He's likely to have been a 6th Ward associate of Dowling and Clancy. While the Colonel may already have been a colonel at the time of the 1860 murder hoax, he may have reached that rank in the first 2 years of the Civil War, prior to the publication of Morford's sketch in January 1863. Nor am I sure whether the Mr. Matsell, named in the 1877 Tribune article, was a witting or unwitting participant in the hoax. And the extent and scope of newspaper coverage of the murder and hoax seems likely to be even greater than what I have found so far. However, there is enough evidence to understand how the infamous Long Branch murder of 1860 happened. The actual crime turns out not to have been a murder at all, but rather was the hoax. And while newspapers reported both the murder and the hoax, only 17 years later was anyone named as having been responsible. As for the hoax's mastermind and chief perpetrator, the leading suspect appears to be an otherwise heroic police officer on vacation, whose motive was to win a $50 bet by recreating parts of a crime he had solved a week earlier, and who showed up the next morning at the beach crime scene and made the front page of the New York Times, Captain Joseph Dowling, later Judge Dowling. His accomplice was John Clancy, then editor of the New York Leader. Henry Morford consciously hid both men's identities in his 1863 sketch. 14 years later, they were both deceased, and the Tribune could safely disclose the truth of what had occurred. Other explanations of the hoax may be possible, but for now, this explanation appears to fit the available evidence. The positive outcome of it all for Long Branch may have been the weeks-long burst of free newspaper publicity, as first news of the murder, and then news of the hoax, and then outrage and humorous commentary on the hoax circulated through newspapers in New York City and across the country. Free publicity. Outside of Long Branch, the hoax demonstrated the tremendous potential of a newer technology, the telegraph, potential for doing both harm and good. The hoax showed at least some newspaper editors and readers that fake news and legitimate news differed, that distantly transmitted brief telegraphs and investigative reporters on the scene conveyed different information differently, and that faster news was not necessarily better news. That such issues may be raised about an event back in 1860 is a reminder that the Long Branch murder hoax may provide a historical perspective from which one might reflect upon the relationship between technology and news in our own time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Please join us for some refreshment.
And we'll take questions.
I would be glad to take some questions if we have time. I don't want to stop anyone from getting refreshments, though. Questions?
Just a comment. So in terms of the murder, nobody done it.
Nobody done it, correct. That's right, nobody done it.
No, nothing.
Yes, true.
Because the only Clancy, was that the third person I remember being Clancy, Lancet?
The colonel.
The colonel.
I have not yet identified the colonel. Don't blame the Kentucky Fried Chicken guy. Other questions? If you have questions or comments, please send them to me at the university, sblair@monmouth.edu.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks for your solve. Thank you.